But I'm gonna take the time now to gloat a little bit. You know what I'm saying? I know what I was. I was that guy.
That's what I.
Coming out of USC, he was a home run hitter with great body control. He didn't have game-breaking speed, yet certainly wasn't slow. But he was big, strong, and physical, and had the acceleration and route running needed to get separation. But even if he didn't get the separation, he was a 6'4", big-bodied possession receiver who had no problem going across the middle for the tough catches, even if he was giving himself up for a big hit. But you wonder how many of those hits could have been avoided, as he didn't always have the greatest quarterbacks throwing him the ball. Keyshawn Johnson was a generational receiver prospect entering the '96 NFL draft and would join the New York Jets after being made the first overall pick. He would have great production on some up and down Jets teams and continue that with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, eventually winning a Super Bowl before ending his playing days with a few solid years on a couple other teams. But over his career, Johnson didn't help himself by sometimes throwing his teammates under the bus and rarely taking accountability.
Keyshawn ain't throwing the ball to himself, and Keyshawn ain't calling the plays, and Keyshawn ain't protecting.
Which contributed to him being given the dreaded diva label. And while his career is often looked at as an underachievement due to the expectations, the numbers are definitely there. And you could almost always count on number 19 to be out on that field every Sunday and producing while he was out there. Let's jog your memory. A Los Angeles native, Keyshawn Johnson could have gone down a completely different route, as he was dealing drugs as a young teen, even spending 9 months in a juvenile facility due to possession of drugs and a firearm. And even though Johnson had a gift on the gridiron, he would say that he was gang affiliated, as football wasn't his priority. But when he was on the football field, he was special, spending most of his high school years playing for Palisades before wrapping up his senior season at Susan Dorsey High School. And during the winter of his senior year, he would commit to the University of Miami Hurricanes. But when it came time to actually go to Miami, he would find out he was ineligible due to his low SAT scores, as he wouldn't even make it out of California, and would then enroll at West Los Angeles Community College instead. But this didn't last long either, as after 8 games, Johnson just stopped showing up for practice, as he was falling in further with a bad crowd, and his behavior had upset many involved with the program, who had grown tired of Johnson's attitude and wanted him cut for good. But Johnson would return to West LA in the spring, yet was told by his coach to sit out the upcoming season to get his priorities straight. And Johnson would oblige, as now his goal was to get to USC, his hometown school, who had surprisingly not recruited the homegrown star throughout high school. But this wasn't a talent issue. It was that USC decided against recruiting any Prop 48 candidates, which was unfortunate because Johnson and USC's history went all the way back to Johnson's early childhood, when a 7-year-old Johnson started attending Trojan's training camp as a ball boy. So Johnson got serious and returned to the West LA team on a mission and showed not only his star factor, but also his entertainment factor on multiple occasions, such as in a win over Santa Barbara City College when Johnson took a pass 91 yards to the end zone, but he just kept running until he was looking over the ocean, or when he returned a kick for a 90-yard touchdown against LA Pierce Junior College and ran right out of the end zone again, except this time he went to a concession stand to get a drink. And by the time Johnson's 94 junior season rolled around, he was finally wearing the Cardinal in gold. USC was coming off a solid 8-5 season and a win over Utah in the Freedom Bowl, but they needed Johnson, as they had just lost program legend Johnny Morton to the NFL. Johnson would join an offense quarterbacked by senior Rob Johnson and featuring future Hall of Fame left tackle Tony Baselli. And although Johnson was a newcomer in D1 football, he was head and shoulders above everyone. The 6'4" receiver would come in and lead the Trojans in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns, while averaging nearly 20 yards a catch, as he was near the top of the conference in all major categories, leading to him being named first team All Pac-10 and a third team All-American. The Trojans would start the year at 2-2 before rattling off 5 straight wins and defeating ranked opponents Washington State and Arizona in back-to-back weeks. They would then be upset by UCLA before tying with Notre Dame in the final game of the year to finish with a 7-3-1 regular season record. And while they weren't going to be playing for the national championship, they would still be playing in the Cotton Bowl versus Texas Tech. Johnson would save his best for last, as he would go for a Cotton Bowl record 222 receiving yards with 3 touchdowns, en route to winning offensive MVP. And the game was over early, as USC was up 28-0 after 1 quarter, and would score 48 points before Texas Tech got on the board, with the Trojans adding another trophy to the collection after a 55-14 victory, as Johnson's first season at SC would see him catch 58 balls for 1,140 yards and 6 touchdowns, while averaging 19.7 yards per reception. The 95 Trojans had a new starting QB in Brad Otten and a new starting running back in Deion Washington, who would rack up over 1,000 yards on the ground. But Johnson made the Trojans' offense worth the price of admission. USC's defense was their strong point, finishing top 10 in points allowed, but they were also putting up over 26 points per game. USC looked like a national championship contender in the first half of the season, going 6-0 with an average victory margin of over 24 points. But things came unraveled in the second half, kicked off by a 38-10 loss against Notre Dame, where Johnson reeled in 6 catches for 122 yards and the Trojans' only touchdown. Then they would tie the following week with Washington before winning their next 2 against Stanford and Oregon State, as a game-winning touchdown from Johnson against Stanford would clinch a bowl game berth for the Trojans. But they would end their regular season with another loss to UCLA, as they would finish at 8-2-1, with Johnson recording a then Pac-10 record 90 receptions, as he would also lead the conference in receiving yards and finish tied for second in receiving touchdowns, en route to another first-team All-Conference selection while being named Pac-10 Player of the Year and a first-team All-American. So after their mediocre second half of the season, USC's national title hopes were gone. But their final game of the season was close to home, as the 17th ranked Trojans would get a Rose Bowl berth versus 3rd ranked Northwestern. And for the second straight year, Johnson showed up under the bright lights, this time turning in 12 catches for 216 yards and a touchdown, as the Trojans would put up 41 points on the Wildcats and win by 9, as Johnson's senior year had ended with him catching 90 balls for 1,218 yards and 6 touchdowns, while adding 47 yards on the ground. And now, it was on to the next level for the supremely talented Johnson, where he was about to join rare company. The 96 NFL Draft contained some of the best players at their position in the history of the game, like Jonathan Ogden, Ray Lewis, and Brian Dawkins. But the wide receiver position was arguably the deepest, as 8 receivers from the draft would garner Pro Bowl selections, and as of 2024, 2 are in the Hall of Fame. But the receiver who was at the top of everyone's board was the big-bodied, big personality Johnson, who was drawing some comparisons to his idol and all-time great Jerry Rice. And his pro day only helped his stock, where he reportedly ran a sub 4.5 40 and recorded a 36-inch vertical leap. So it wasn't really a secret that Johnson was going to be the first receiver off the board, but there was a lot of talk about him being the first player off the board.
Wide receiver, Southern California.
Johnson would make history and become just the 3rd wide receiver taken first overall in the NFL draft after Dave Parks in 1965 and Irving Fryar in 1984. The New York Jets hadn't made the playoffs in 5 years and were coming off a 3-13 season, as they were looking for that game-breaking type of player that Johnson had shown he could be in college. And Johnson was marketable as well, which would help boost New York's popularity, and it put New York in the fans' good graces, as many wanted the Jets to take Johnson first overall. And while his talent was undeniable, it may have caused the Jets to overlook some things, as Johnson would score just an 11 on his Wonderlic, which was 10 points below the average. But also undeniable was that Johnson was a businessman as much as he was a football player, having already signed a lucrative shoe deal with Adidas prior to even being drafted, as Johnson would make history in the 96 season by becoming the first NFL player to make his debut in his signature shoe, when he took the field in the Adidas EQT Key Trainer. And when he was on the field, Johnson played about as good as he could for the situation he was in. The Jets were coached by the infamous Rich Kotite, and had signed a quarterback best known for an infamous performance in the previous year's Super Bowl in Neil O'Donnell, who would have an underwhelming debut season in New York before a shoulder injury would end his year after 6 games. New York did feature a couple bright spots on the offensive end, as they would get a great year out of running back Adrian Morrell, and they had a second-year receiver who was pretty much the polar opposite of Johnson personality-wise, in the sure-handed Wayne Chrebet, as these two would combine for over 1,750 yards and 11 touchdowns this season. On top of having one of the worst offenses, The Jets also had one of the worst defenses and would start the season 0-6 under O'Donnell. Johnson's first career game saw him catch one ball for 50 yards. Then he would catch touchdowns in his next two games versus Miami and Indianapolis. He would have one of his best games in week 5 with 8 catches, but then in practice, he would injure his knee and would miss the next 2 games. Once he returned, he had veteran Frank Reich throwing him the ball, yet the Jets were still winless. But his return game would be his best of the year, with 8 catches for 94 yards and 2 touchdowns. Then the following week, he would have 7 catches for 94 yards and a touchdown in the Jets' first win of the season over Arizona. And when the season came to an end, Johnson was 3rd among rookies in receiving yards and receptions, and 1st in touchdowns, as his 8 receiving touchdowns would be a Jets rookie record, and his 63 receptions would come up just short of Chrebet's record of 66, set the year before. But the Week 9 win over Arizona had been New York's only win of the year, as they would finish the season at 1-15, with Johnson's rookie campaign seeing him pull down 63 balls for 844 yards and 8 touchdowns. But Johnson had released a book after his rookie season, which wouldn't make him any friends. After his first year in New York, Johnson had released an autobiography, and in that book, he had some choice words for his teammates and his coaches. And while there may have been truth in some of the things Johnson was saying, it wasn't going to help him in the locker room. But maybe things would be better now that the Jets had completely overhauled their coaching staff, bringing in Bill Parcells at head coach, Charlie Weis at offensive coordinator, and Bill Belichick at defensive coordinator. And these guys would turn the franchise around quickly. Belichick would turn the Jets into one of the league's stingiest defenses, allowing nearly 10 less points per game than last year. And the offense would see a lot of improvement as well, scoring over 4 more points per game in 1997. O'Donnell would start for the majority of the season before losing his starting job to Glenn Foley in the second last game of the year. The Jets would get another 1,000-yard season out of Morrell, and Chrebet would do his usual consistent work, but would fall to the Jets' second leading receiver behind Johnson, who would play a full 16 games and up his receptions and receiving yards. He and Chrebet combined for over 1,760 yards and 8 touchdowns, and by week 4, the Jets had already doubled their win total from last year. Johnson's touchdown total was down from last season, but 97 would see him record his first career 100-yard game in a Week 13 win over Minnesota, when he had 9 catches for 104 yards. Then over the next 2 games, he would haul in 12 passes for 178 yards and a touchdown. But the Jets would lose both and go 1-3 in their final 4 games to finish the season at 9-7, which wouldn't be enough for a playoff berth, as Johnson would end the year with 70 catches for 963 yards and 4 touchdowns. And going into 98, the Jets had a new look, and Johnson had what seemed to be his breakout season. The Jets made a huge splash in the offseason by acquiring former Pro Bowl running back Curtis Martin, which led to them shipping Morrell to the Cardinals. And they would sign another former first overall pick in quarterback Vinny Testaverde, who would turn in a career year in 1998. So the Jets would feature a top 2 defense in 98, and now with a capable QB and star running back, they would boast a top 5 offense as well. Johnson and Chrebet were one of the best receiving duos in the league, combining for over 2,200 yards and 18 touchdowns. Johnson would lead the team in receptions, receiving yards, and touchdowns, as he would finish top 10 in the NFL in all 3 categories, en route to being named to his first career Pro Bowl, as well as being named to the Football Writers' first team All-Pro. Johnson would start the season on a tear, as in the first game of the year, he had 9 catches for 126 yards and 2 touchdowns, and he would find the end zone in each of his first 4 games. But after 5 games, the Jets were just 2-3, but then they would go 10-1 over the remainder of the season, with Johnson turning in an especially good 5-game stretch from weeks 10 to 14, where he averaged over 100 yards receiving, which also included his first rushing attempt and rushing touchdown of his career. And with the Jets finishing at 12-4, they were finally back in the playoffs and hosting their first playoff game in 12 years, when the Jaguars came to town for the divisional. Johnson again showed up when the lights were brightest, as his first playoff game saw him lead all receivers with 9 catches and 121 yards, while opening the scoring with a 21-yard touchdown reception in the first quarter. And the Jets would go wire to wire, leading for the entire 60 minutes as they were on to an AFC Championship matchup with the defending champion Denver Broncos. This would be a defensive battle until the Broncos blew it open with 23rd quarter points. Johnson would have a solid 7 catches for 73 yards, but the Jets would fall 1 game short of a Super Bowl appearance. as Johnson's year had seen him haul in 83 balls for 1,131 yards and a career-high 10 touchdowns, while rushing 2 times for 60 yards and another score. So the Jets looked like a true contender going into 99, but that all changed in the season opener. The Jets had locked up Testaverde long-term after his great 98 season, but then in the first game of the year versus New England, he would rupture his Achilles, ending his season, as this year would see 6 players throw passes for the Jets, including punter Tom Tupa, and even Johnson himself would throw a pass. Martin would have another great year, but their passing numbers would understandably suffer. Chrebet would also miss the first 5 games with a broken foot, as Johnson drew all the defensive attention on passing plays. Yet he would still improve on last season and would post then career highs in receptions and receiving yards, as he would finish top 10 in the NFL in receptions and earn his 2nd straight Pro Bowl selection. Johnson would have some of his best pro performances this year, as the season opener saw him haul in 8 catches for a career-high 194 yards and a touchdown, as he would play well over the first 5 games of the season while Chrebet was healing. Yet the Jets would only manage 1 win in those 5 games. Johnson would have modest performances over the majority of the remaining games, but did have a 3-game stretch from weeks 13 to 15 when he would record 2 games with double-digit receptions, including a then career high of 11 in a week 13 victory over Miami. And although they would improve, their slow start would be too much to recover from, as the Jets would manage an 8-8 record but would miss the playoffs, as Johnson's season had seen him catch 89 passes for 1,170 yards and 8 touchdowns, while adding 12 yards on the ground. But with 2 years left on his contract, Johnson wanted to renegotiate, but New York didn't. On April 12, 2000, Johnson was traded to Tampa Bay for a pair of first-round picks. The reason for this being that some reports had Johnson threatening to hold out if he did not receive a contract closer to market value for a player of his caliber from New York, as new Cowboys receiver Joey Galloway had just signed a lucrative deal. But the Jets had a policy to not negotiate with players who had over a year left on their contract. And even if they would negotiate with Johnson, they didn't have near the cap space needed to accommodate his desired salary. And reportedly, new Jets head coach Al Groh had likened Johnson to a child asking for a raise in his allowance, which offended Johnson. So the trade was made, and afterwards, Johnson would become the highest paid receiver in the NFL after signing an 8-year, $56 million deal. So after 4 years in the AFC, Johnson was now in the NFC, playing for a Bucs team with elite defensive talent and coached by Tony Dungy, as they were coming off an 11-5 season and a divisional round loss to Washington. The Bucs' top receiver last year was Jaquez Green, who had less than 800 yards, as the Bucs' passing attack had been one of the worst in the NFL, and they felt getting a true number 1 like Johnson would push them over the top. But Tampa Bay was a run-first team with their WD-40 duo of Warrick Dunn and Mike Alstott, and for as good as Johnson could be, he again was dealing with less than stellar quarterback play from the second-year Sean King, as although Johnson would lead the team in receptions, receiving yards, and touchdowns, he would put up some of his lowest receiving totals in 3 seasons, as he would miss the Pro Bowl. The Bucs would start 3-0 before losing 4 straight, as Johnson had just 1 touchdown in that stretch. He would have his first 100-yard game of the year in a Week 8 win versus Minnesota, which would kick off a 3-game win streak. He would have 1 more 100-yard performance in the second last game of the season versus St. Louis, and over the second half of the year, Tampa Bay had gone 6-2 to finish at 10-6 and get a wildcard berth to play the Eagles. While Johnson would finish with 6 catches for 106 yards, over 80 of those yards came in the 4th quarter with the game already decided, but he was still the only Buc to show up on an offense that finished with less than 200 total yards in a 21-3 loss, as Johnson's first year in Tampa saw him catch 71 balls for 874 yards and 8 touchdowns, while adding 5 yards on the ground. Over the offseason, the Bucs went out and got a QB, as they signed former Pro Bowler Brad Johnson, and Keyshawn Johnson again showed that if you gave him a competent QB, he could produce at a Pro Bowl level, as he would turn in arguably the greatest season of his career. The Bucs' rushing attack suffered big time, as Dunn was banged up most of the season and would miss the final 4 games of the year. So without a potent rushing attack, they had to rely a lot more on their passing, and Johnson was option number 1, as he would put up career highs in receptions and receiving yards and would finish top 10 in the league in both categories. while making a return to the Pro Bowl. But the one thing he did struggle to do was find the end zone, as his single receiving touchdown would be a career low. Johnson would have a great start to the season, with back-to-back games going over 140 receiving yards in the first 5 weeks. Then in a Week 10 loss to Chicago, he would haul in a career-high 12 passes for 89 yards. It wouldn't be until Week 13 that he would catch his first touchdown pass in a game where he had 10 receptions for 101 yards, and then would follow that up with another game over 100 yards receiving, as he surpassed the century mark 4 times this season. Yet he would miss the season finale versus Philly, but he would still get a chance to play the Eagles, as once again the 9-7 Bucs would get a wildcard rematch with Philadelphia. But this time, Johnson was mostly a non-factor. He would have 2 first-half catches, with the majority of his yardage coming on a second quarter 46-yard reception. Then he would total just 12 more yards on 1 reception in the second half, as he finished with 75 yards for the game, and the Bucs again had a poor offensive showing in a 31-9 loss. But Johnson's great regular season had seen him haul in a career-high 106 receptions for a career-high 1,266 yards and 1 touchdown. But the 0-2 season was the year the Bucs put everything together. In mid-January, Tampa Bay gave Dungy his walking papers, as it was widely believed that the Bucs were going to get Johnson's old coach, Bill Parcells, to come out of retirement and lead the team. But less than a week later, Parcells shot that down. So instead, the Bucs would pull off the rare coach trade, as they sent a package headlined by cash and a pair of first-rounders to Oakland for head coach Jon Gruden. So there was a lot of pressure on Gruden and the Bucs. But luckily for Gruden, he was already inheriting one of the league's best defenses, who would only get better under him, as the 0-2 Bucs only allowed about 12 points per game to lead the NFL. After his injury-filled season, Tampa Bay let Dunn walk and brought in Michael Pittman as his replacement. Then to give Brad Johnson some weapons, they signed former Pro Bowl receiver Keenan McCardell as well as Joe Jaravicius to give them a more complete receiving corps. Johnson would see his numbers drop, but he also saw nearly 40 less targets, with Brad Johnson having more guys to spread the ball around to. Nonetheless, Keyshawn Johnson still led the team in receptions and receiving yards, as he and McCardell combined for over 1,750 yards through the air. Over the first half of the season, Johnson recorded just 1 game with over 100 receiving yards, but in the second half he would record 2 more games with at least 100 yards through the air, which included a 9-reception, 133-yard, and 2-touchdown performance in a Week 9 defeat of Minnesota. And although the Bucs weren't putting up huge numbers on offense, it didn't really matter when they had a defense like theirs, as they would hold opponents to 10 points or less on 9 occasions, en route to a 12-4 record, which was tops in the NFC South. The divisional round brought the 49ers, and Tampa Bay would run through them with an easy 31-6 win, as Johnson would haul in 5 passes for 85 yards, and was now making his second career conference championship appearance, where the Bucs would meet the Eagles for the 3rd straight year. But this time, they were ready, as they held the Eagles to 10 points in a 27-10 win. And even though Johnson had just 3 catches for 40 yards, he added a touchdown and helped the Bucs punch their ticket to Super Bowl 37. Waiting for Tampa was Gruden's former team in the Oakland Raiders, but they were coached by Bill Callahan, who had been an assistant to Gruden, and he clearly didn't make enough adjustments, as Gruden was 2 steps ahead of him all game. Keenan McCardell would steal the show on offense with 2 touchdowns, but Johnson still managed 6 catches for 69 yards, while being covered by Charles Woodson. And then Tampa Bay's defense took over in the second half with 3 touchdowns in a 48-21 beatdown, as Johnson was now a Super Bowl champion, and his regular season had seen him pull down 76 receptions for 1,088 yards and 5 touchdowns. But the following season would be far from drama-free for Johnson and the Bucs. Tampa Bay looked very capable of repeating going into the 0-3 season, bringing back virtually the same roster and adding running back Thomas Jones through a trade with Arizona. Over the first 10 games, Johnson had been extremely up and down, made evident in weeks 7 through 11 when he had just 2 receptions for 11 total yards over weeks 7 and 8, but then had 15 receptions for over 200 yards over the next 2 games, before a 3-reception, 34-yard performance in a week 11 loss to Green Bay, as the Bucs were struggling on offense, and after 10 games, they were sitting at 4-6. But Johnson had been having an internal issue with Gruden all season, which ultimately led to the Buccaneers deactivating Johnson for the remainder of the season. Reportedly, Johnson was upset with Gruden all year, feeling that he deliberately decreased his workload to show that he could win without him, because as Johnson would say, Gruden never liked him and he was never Gruden's guy. And according to the Bucs front office, Johnson had made it clear early in the season that he didn't want to be in Tampa Bay anymore, and reportedly leading up to his deactivation, had skipped practice and missed curfew among other things. But the Bucs refused to release the receiver who had 4 years left on his contract, so that they could guarantee some sort of compensation for Johnson, either through free agency or an eventual trade. And after the Johnson deactivation, the Bucs would go 3-3 the rest of the way to finish at 7-9 and miss the playoffs, as Johnson's 10 games had seen him reel in 45 passes for 600 yards and 3 touchdowns. And then over the offseason, Johnson would get his wish and get out of Tampa Bay. In mid-March, a soon-to-be 32-year-old Johnson was traded to the Dallas Cowboys for Joey Galloway, seeing Johnson reunite with Bill Parcells, who Dallas had coaxed out of retirement last season. The Cowboys were coming off a 10-6 year and had a bit of a Jets reunion going, as they had also brought in Vinny Testaverde, who would become the team starter after they released Quincy Carter. The rushing attack featured a rookie Julius Jones and the newly signed Eddie George, who had been part of Johnson's draft class. And Johnson would also line up opposite of another member of his draft class in receiver Terry Glenn, yet Glenn would only manage 6 games this season. Now in year 9, Johnson would be a solid veteran presence during his time with Dallas. His first year as a Cowboy would see him lead the team in receiving yards and finish second in receptions, while tying for the team lead in touchdowns, with tight end Jason Witten. Johnson's Cowboys debut would see him pull down 9 receptions for 111 yards versus Minnesota, and he would have his only multi-touchdown game in a Week 8 defeat of Detroit, when he had 3 receptions, with 2 of them being touchdowns. He would have one more game with over 100 yards in a Week 13 defeat of Seattle, but Dallas regressed from last season, as their defense had declined significantly, leading to them missing the playoffs with a 6-10 record, as Johnson's year had seen him haul in 70 receptions for 981 yards and 6 touchdowns, while adding 13 yards on the ground. 05 would be much of the same for Johnson. Testaverde was gone, but they had brought in former All-Pro Drew Bledsoe. Terry Glenn would be healthy and would lead the team in receiving yards and touchdowns, while Johnson finished second on the team in both categories, while leading the Cowboys in receptions. Johnson would start the season with 2 receiving touchdowns in a win over San Diego, yet would crack 100 yards receiving just once, in a Week 6 defeat of the Giants, when he had 8 catches for 120 yards. Overall, the Cowboys looked better with a much improved defense, but after a 7-3 start, they would go 2-4 to end the year, and their 9-7 record wouldn't be enough for the playoffs, as Johnson's year had seen him catch 71 balls for 839 yards and 6 touchdowns, while adding 3 yards on the ground. But the Cowboys needed cap space over the offseason, and Johnson would be a casualty. With an opportunity to sign another one of Johnson's draft mates in Terrell Owens, the Cowboys would cut Johnson to free up salary to complete the Owens signing. But about a week later, Johnson would sign a 4-year deal with the Carolina Panthers. The Panthers were a few years removed from a Super Bowl appearance and were looking to add a capable second receiver for quarterback Jake Delhomme to complement star wideout Steve Smith, and Johnson would fill that role well. The 34-year-old receiver would start all 16 games and would finish second to Smith in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. He would have his only 100-yard game of the season in a Week 2 loss to Minnesota, when he had 5 catches for 106 yards. He would become the first player in NFL history to catch a touchdown pass for 4 different teams on Monday Night Football, when he had 7 catches for 97 yards and a touchdown in a defeat of Tampa Bay. The Panthers were solid, but a 4-game losing streak late in the season dashed their playoff hopes, as they finished at 8-8 and missed the postseason, as Johnson's year had ended with him catching 70 passes for 815 yards and 4 touchdowns, while adding another touchdown on the ground. But that was it for Keyshawn Johnson, as after being cut, he would announce his retirement in late May of 2007, after 11 years. He reportedly still had interest from quite a few teams, but decided to turn down a playing career for a television career, as he would join ESPN and work with them for over 15 years. Keyshawn Johnson has both an underrated and underwhelming career. He retired as part of the 10K club and was consistent and durable throughout his 11 years. He wasn't afraid of the physicality of the game and produced everywhere he went, and was also held back due to a lot of quarterback instability. But he was compared to Jerry Rice and was a first overall pick, so he was expected to be an all-time great, and didn't live up to that either. And it doesn't help that he didn't even end up being the best receiver in his draft class. But Keyshawn Johnson was an above-average receiver for his entire career, who was great in a few of those seasons. He played in some situations that didn't allow him to maximize his talents, but also could have done more on his own to improve. In his early years, he felt that if his team wanted to win, they needed to get him the ball, but he also didn't react well when he didn't get the ball. And while that's not all that uncommon in number one receivers, it painted him as selfish and a diva. He became much more of a team player in his later years and retired in good standing. And even though his career leaves something to be desired, Keyshawn Johnson left the NFL as a Pro Bowl receiver with over 10,000 yards and a Super Bowl ring. So what more was there left for him to prove? But that's it for today's episode on Keyshawn Johnson. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his 96 draft mates, or this one on a player he beat in the 02 Super Bowl. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.